If you've been following the headlines, you've seen a backlash to diversity, equity, and inclusion that has muddied the waters and misrepresented the intent behind these efforts. Where do we go from here? This week, I talk with Julie Kratz, founder of Next Pivot Point and a longtime inclusion and allyship strategist. Julie helps us cut through the noise and focus on what works so we can use the power we already have to build cultures where people belong. In our conversation, Julie shares the difference between power with and power over. She also shares a simple way to inventory our own sources of power. And we discuss why going back to basics like trust, self awareness, and clear measurement is the most practical path forward. We also talk about meeting persuadable people where they are, starting with a personal why, and building momentum together so that you're not a lone voice. Thank you so much, as always, for listening.
Welcome to the Impostor Syndrome Files. My name is Kim Meninger, and as an executive coach and former high-tech leader, my personal mission is to help professionals overcome imposter syndrome so that you can advance your career with confidence. Each week, I interview a new guest who brings a powerful perspective to this conversation, including personal stories, best practices, and new insights. The more we talk about this issue, the more we destigmatize imposter syndrome, recognize that we're not alone, and empower ourselves to access the tools and resources that can help us and those around us. Thank you so much for listening and for sharing with others you think would benefit from this conversation. Welcome, Julie. It's so great to have you here today. I would love to start by inviting you to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And my background, I did the corporate thing coming out of college. I thought, like most aspiring leaders, that we wanted to climb the corporate ladder. And so I diligently kind of managed my career and checked all the boxes that you're supposed to do to advance and be promoted. And after 4 years and being moved multiple times and achieving some success as by way of promotions, I just decided to take a pause, go back to school. So that's when I got my MBA, and I studied marketing, which was kind of interesting because I came out of school doing strategy work and consulting work. As often we find our ways into different types of work than we actually thought we would. And then eventually just that elusive feeling of like not feeling like I was included or belong in nearly every corporate setting that I was in through the 12 years, I started my own business. And I've had my own business, Next Pivot Point, from the last 10 years. So we specialize in inclusion and allyship training programs within organizations. And I've got to work with some really cool organizations and leaders over the years, Google, Amazon, all sorts of folks, and all sorts of leaders that are kind of wrestling with what's next, how can we have a more inclusive workplace? And so really thankful for the work I get to do.
Well, I'm really thankful for the work you're doing, and I know it's got to be even more challenging in this moment than it had been it's always been challenging work, but especially now. And so I'd love to hear a little bit more about the inclusion and the allyship work that you're doing. What are you seeing out there today? Is there still commitment to this work? We see a lot of dark headlines, but I'm curious like what it looks like today.
Yeah. Yeah. No, you're not wrong. It's really interesting that the word inclusion is controversial, that the word ally is controversial. I think there's just a lot of misunderstanding. People fear what they don't understand. And so sometimes when they hear DEI as an acronym, we know that that can elicit unnecessary fear. But when you use the words diversity, equity, inclusion, it's less jarring for people. Like, of course, I support that. So it's the really interesting juxtaposition in my work. And I've seen, the roller coaster ride over the last decade. So this isn't new. The backlash started a few years ago, actually. And so we've been experiencing hardship for quite some time. This is next level, though. Questioning the legality of our work is a big challenge. I've not ever had to work with attorneys as much to review content that, they're not an expert in. And I feel that's really unfair to question the legality of something that you haven't defined what it is or what is legal and illegal. And so I think the big misunderstandings that people need to understand is that one, 99% of DEI work is 100% legal. Attorneys will tell you that. There's a few guidelines you can make sure that you're following, but also like it's it's a time when we really need people with power to step up. And if this doesn't feel right to you, if practicing exclusion or not wanting a culture where people feel that they belong in your workplace, that doesn't feel viscerally right to you, we really need you to speak up. We really need you to take a stand right now because people like me, practitioners inside organizations, are being muted, they're being silenced, they're being overly supervised, let go, titles changing. And so, this moment, we really need our allies now more than ever, especially those with power.
So, can you define allyship in your own terms? Because I think that is another one that we hear a lot, but don't necessarily take the time to understand. What do we mean by who's an ally? How do we know if we're an ally? What, what are some of the ways that you describe it?
Yeah, yeah, and I'm a little facetious in my trainings. I don't love to give my personal definition. I use a very basic one that's kind of a straw man for people to kind of pull from. I think it is a choose your own adventure approach. There's no arrival point where someone's going to say, "You're an ally. Here's your certificate." Although organizations will try to do that, and like I always kind of cringe. Like that's not how this is supposed to work. It's not a self-proclamation. It's a journey, not a destination, right? I'm still learning. So I think just accepting that we're all allies in training, even the naysayers that, there's like 10% of the population that doesn't believe in allyship. So like, why focus on them? Let's focus on the 90% that do want and are persuadable towards this cause of essentially supporting people that are different from yourself. That's the basic. And you can take that much deeper. I'll get challenged for people that's not enough, Julie. I'll get challenged for people that's too vague. But I say that on purpose. It's using your power for good. Power is a chance to be an ally. And I found in my research that for a new book that I wrote that people misunderstand their power. One, they don't see it because you have it, so it's invisible to you, where it's very visible to others. People underestimate their power, positional power, social influence, proxy to power, identity power. There's so many sources of power. And there's a misunderstanding too that power is bad. Like that it's somehow like gross to admit that I have power. It's like power is a chance to be an ally. And this is a real entry point to the work. It's an invitation to use your power for good.
Mm. Well, and I think it's so important that you shared that because I see that a lot too. There is this kind of ick factor associated with power, but I often frame it as power to as opposed to power over because I think it's power over that makes us uncomfortable, right? And so there are a lot of people out there who aren't interested in, managing people for its own sake. They don't want to be in control, so to speak. But when you have these other forms of power that you're talking about, it gives us an opportunity to influence and to
Mhm.
become a voice for people who don't have that kind of power and
Yeah.
influence.
Yeah. Yeah. That's one of the most powerful concepts from the feedback I've gotten in my new book about people with power and how to be allies is power with versus power over. And so you're exactly right. Power over is like, oh, I'm going to do this thing for you. And it's centering me in the narrative as the ally instead of centering the person that's getting the allyship. And it's continuing to put the spotlight on the person with power. And really, it's not a sustainable model because you're always having to facilitate whatever help or support the person needs. Whereas more sustainable model is a power with model where you share your power, and sharing your power actually grows your power. So by giving it to somebody else, you don't lose it because now you have somebody that's rising that you've supported that's probably going to have a reciprocal effect on you. And that could be mentorship, that could be sponsoring somebody, that could be advocating for someone else's career or needs, or coaching, putting up the mirror and helping people see maybe what they don't quite see in themselves just yet. Getting over imposter syndrome, as I'm sure you can appreciate. That's something that my allies helped me with a ton. When I reflected on my corporate America experiences, the only reason I survived as long as I did is because I had amazing allies. And still to this day, and the introductions, the opportunities that my allies have made for me has absolutely contributed to my success. We find our opportunities through people, not through posting randomly online with the AI scrubbers and all those things. It's people that create the opportunities for us. And so finding our way to our allies now and that power with approach is so critical.
So for people who are questioning whether they have power or what forms of power they might have, like, is there a way to check in with yourself on that? Like, is there a way to sort of assess whether or not you have power and in what ways?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. There's a lot of different power models out there I found. So I'm not an expert in power structures. I'll just say that. It's allyship. But the power piece just came up so profoundly. Um, and so one of the inventories I have people do, and this can backfire sometimes if you don't facilitate this really carefully. But one of the exercises I do is just a dimensions of power inventory with folks. And so if listeners, if you've seen something like a privilege walk, which we don't do those for obvious reasons anymore, but if you've participated in something like that, it's similar but different. And the reason it's different is how I frame it is take an inventory, and I have like 12 different dimensions, and I kind of float them up as like little towers, and at the top of the towers, a more accessed point to power. So like race would be white people at the top. The bottom, more historically marginalized groups, black or brown. You do the same with disability, neurodivergence, socioeconomic class, um, uh, uh, gender, of course, LGBTQ. The list goes on, right? And so you could even create your own dimensions at your organization and make them as broad as possible. Age is something that is relatable across all most humans. So find things that aren't polarizing like race and gender. I think we realized with the backlash, we really hit hard on those, and those are very important parts of identity. But for obvious reasons, white guys are kind of like, oh, this isn't for me. And so make it broad and structure it in a way that people understand it's not a bad thing. It's not a comparison game. This isn't my score's worse or better than yours. It's really, hey, how do I do in these 12 dimensions of power? And for me, 9 of the 12 I have at the top of the power, right? And so that's a chance to be an ally. And then what I do is lead people through an exercise of what kind of ally do you want to be? How do you want to use that power for good? And I talk about the different ally roles and how to show up in those roles. And so I had a participant in a workshop recently say, Julie, I've been through that exercise before, the power dimensions, or maybe it was called privilege, or sometimes they just say the P word just to not trigger anybody. I've been through this before and it was awful and I felt ashamed and I felt terrible walking out of the room. But when you showed me the umbrella with all these different roles and things I could do with it, I made the connection of like, oh, I can help. And I thought we were always doing that, but clearly some weird work has happened in the last few years. So I think it's just really insightful that you don't leave people to just sit in that, give them something to do with it.
Hmm.
And can't really tell people what to do. I really struggle with this. The number one question I get is like, just Julie, tell me how to be an ally. And it's like, it's very nuanced. It's very personal. Like it could look very different for the person you're trying to be an ally for than like what you think support looks like. So there's no inventory, but I do think if you can give people some entry point ideas, it really gets the comfort level up so that you can have a more brave conversation.
Yeah, I think you're hitting on a lot of the hidden challenges that I think are really important because on the surface, like you said, who wouldn't, there's a small fraction of people who resist what we're talking about, right, outright. But I think that one of the things that I think about a lot is just that people feel, and it's all subjective, right? People feel very stressed and overwhelmed right now. And I think a lot of people feel like they are not in a position of power, as we've been talking about. I think the economic uncertainty is making people feel really unstable in their jobs. I think people are under a lot of pressure. Work conditions are not, everybody's working way more hours than they can afford to with little self-care. And so One of the things that I think about a lot is that in order to get people to think about others, right, is you have to be taking care of your own needs first, right? Like you cannot, it's almost like the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Like if you're not meeting your own basic needs, you're not going to be thoughtful about what someone else needs and how you can best support them. And I wonder if you think about that as part of your work too, and if you're seeing anything out within organizations just around basic stress management and just giving people the tools to take care of themselves so that they can be of greater service to others.
Yeah. Yeah, I am seeing that, and it's only going to get worse. There's some behaviors that are being modeled right now from a high level that are very toxic and harmful. And I think that's been the most surprising thing is to see the lack of courage by business leaders to stand up and speak truth to power. But for now, some of the research that I'm seeing is that, we're kind of reverting back to that chain of command style of leadership where don't ask questions, your thank you's your paycheck, like work long hours, hard work pays off, myth of meritocracy, like, and I struggle because the pendulum swings, right? And so did we get too like feeling oriented and now this is the overcorrection? Okay, there's somewhere in between, right? And at the fundamental level with my work, it's always been what business problem are we trying to solve?
Mhm.
And if you can map training and support to what the business problem is, like you mentioned, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what is that costing us if people don't feel taken care of? I mean, there is a cost associated with that. It's hitting somewhere. It's hitting your retention numbers. It's hitting in your recruiting numbers. It's hitting in your engagement numbers. Wherever it is, get some data, get some intel, get some, qualitative data, some focus groups, whatever it is, and figure out what the business problem is. And if it is stress management or emotional management, or I'm teaching a class on decision making right now, which has been fascinating. Map that curriculum to that problem and measure it. Measure what you're able to do at the beginning and at the end. Are you able to improve the knowledge? What's that worth to the business? Are you able to improve the ability to practice the confidence level with these skills? If you had better decision makers on your team, less stressed people on your team, I mean, imagine what that would look like. And if we can quantify that and I think tell the story and get away from all these like shenanigans and the headlines and all these weird perceptions of what's legal and not legal. Because I mean, I'm going back to the basics. I've taught this curriculum for over 10 years and I have very provoking clients that were very edgy a few years ago. They're now like, Julie, can you just come in and talk about trust? It's like, oh, I mean, yeah, because if you don't have that, I mean, everything else is pointless. So, okay, like I'll meet you there, but I know you're better than, like, not better, but I know you're further along than that. But going back to the basics, mapping into a problem. And then the measurement piece I think is really important. We've always struggled with that in the training and development world. And that's why our budgets are like the first to get slashed because people just see it as this like additive. We've got to get better about measurement. Heck, I mean, AI's got amazing tools. Let's use them. Let's be disciplined with this work. A lot of us, I think, kind of get in our head, the academic types, pedagogy, and all these fancy things. It's like, yeah, but what did it do?
No, you're right. It is a perpetual challenge, and I think there's still just even going back to what you said about the command and control model. I still think that there is a good number of people, or at least people who are unwilling to challenge those in power that believe that it's this either or proposition, right? And that like, oh, we don't have time to do this touchy-feely kind of work because we've got important business to do and really seeing it as a distraction from that as opposed to something that's actually going to improve your ability to achieve the results that you're looking for.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah, it's an either or. It's not, it's a both and. So one of the things I talk about a lot with inclusive leadership and allyship is it's paradoxical. And we need leaders to embrace paradox right now. It's not you're good, you're bad, you're soft, I don't even know what the opposite of that would be. Like, it's just, it's not an either or. You can do both of these things at the same time. You can be an absolutely strong leader and be incredibly empathetic. Those things can absolutely go hand in hand. I've seen it many, many times. Now, is that being reverend right now? Probably not so much, right? It feels like we got to have a hard, crispy shell to endure all of these, just real big challenges. And so I think it is embracing paradox. I think leaders that can embrace paradox, Brene Brown's done some amazing research on this, where she finds it's one of the most highly correlated variables to leadership performance is the ability to say yes
Hmm.
and tether, because our brains don't like that. Our brains don't love the cognitive dissonance. We don't love to think we know something and then something else is true too. It's really hard to hold that space.
Hmm.
And something I've been practicing, it's hard for me too, right? I want to say, well, if you voted this way, I don't want to have nothing to do with you, right? I think a lot of us feel that way right now. Well, we're not going to get further along and advance the things I personally care about that are highly aligned with my values if I just keep talking to that echo chamber, right? And so you could vote a different way and also be somebody that I could have a relationship with. I'm struggling with that right now. But those two things can happen. And I just think if we had more curiosity, right? If we just exercise more curiosity instead of judgment, from Ted Lasso, if listeners, if you've ever watched that, it's just our brains can't do both things at the same time. So if you're curious, you kind of turn off the judgment mode and can go with the flow a little bit more. And like, I think at the end of the day, people just want to be their like human selves at work, and to have all these unnecessary constraints and hindrances to that is just a disservice to humanity.
Yeah, you're right. And I appreciate your sharing how challenging it is for you to hold those opposing views because I have a similar struggle. And I think it's important, though very hard, to remember that this is a journey and that not everyone is in the same place on the journey. And I think there is, unfortunately, and this has contributed, I think, in large part to a lot of the backlashes, there is an element of the work that is very judgmental and that makes people feel unsafe or it makes them feel demonized and there you made a really good point earlier too about focus on the persuadables, and I think there are a lot of persuadables out there that have been turned off by some of the rhetoric, and I've seen and read work and things that I have felt have been, sort of off-putting. And I think, gosh, I'm a true believer. What must people who are a little bit early, earlier in the journey going to think when they approach this information? And so I really think that to your point, if we want to achieve the vision that we're talking about, we have to get better at suspending judgment and giving people space to get there at their own pace.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think what happened with George Floyd in the summer of 2020, if I had to put my finger on what the problem is, hindsight, right, is 2020, so it's not fair. But I think us DEI people, I mean, that door got swung wide open, and we're like, we're going to cram as much stuff in there while it's open because we know we only have a certain window and we know there's just going to be a backlash. So let's just give them all the stuff. I mean, I was being challenged. I have a pretty wide variety of content, like 40 different workshops, right? So the basics like trust and things like that, but also pretty advanced I mean, I did content on anti-racism and privilege and, pretty jarring stuff. And I was being challenged like, Julie, we need more like harsher, like not harsher, but like go stronger with this. And it's like, I think people thought they were ready and they absolutely were not. Like, we need baby pool, not deep end, and then somewhere in between, right? And I think that's a really hard part of social justice work and inclusion work is how hard do you push and how much do you compromise? Because it always feels like we're compromising. And I get it. Women of color are hurting. 300,000 have left the workforce since the current administration. That's not a coincidence. It isn't, they don't feel safe. They feel very threatened and very betrayed. I do. And I'm not a woman of color. And so I can only imagine how they feel. And all that to say, we've got to find a way to strike the middle of this pendulum. I mean, this is exhausting going back and forth. There has to be something in the middle. And I think that's kind of where I'm at with the work is just taking a meaningful pause, working with clients that my favorite client right now is not a household name. I mean, we've got plenty of household names we've worked with over the years, but that doesn't actually really matter. The work is companies are very similar when you get to know them, the problems, but it sounds cool. This you would not know this company household name. They've been doing allyship programs for years, and they've slowly built up their employee resource groups. They have like three of them now. But they did the work slowly, methodically. They tied it to a business problem. They had a wonderful senior male leader. That's how I became engaged with them at a conference. He was their sponsor, supporting them on the leadership team. And now, we're working on an allyship program rollout, and it's meaningful work. It's purposeful work. It feels right. It feels necessary. It feels like they're bought in. Of course, I'm sure they have naysayers running around there too, but it feels like they're really approaching the persuadables in a very welcoming, inclusive way. And that's the irony, I think, of the work is we got in our own way. It didn't seem inclusive about inclusion. And it's like, I've heard stories and I didn't believe it at first because like I haven't been a part of this. Have I done this? And I'm sure I've contributed to these problems too. But I mean, so many people I interviewed for my book, wonderful white male leaders that I've worked with, I call allies over the years, were like, Julie, I was told I couldn't get promoted because I'm a white man. Or if I make another hire, it has to be a woman of color. I was like, someone told you that? And they're like, no way. And then like three of them told me the same exact stories. I'm like, man, there is some weird stuff that happened. And that really breaks my heart because that was an opportunistic way to advance diversity. That's not a sustainable way. This work is forever work. It's legacy work. It's the slow, methodical approach that's going to win. I know that's not as fun. It bothers me. I get impatient too, but we're not going to, push, push, push this work. It's always going to be met with resistance if we do it that way.
Absolutely. And that can be really frustrating for people who are very action oriented, for people who are, very, very committed. And patience is not something that many of us have. But I think about some of the things that you were saying earlier, and I wonder too if you have thoughts on it's generally easier to do this as a collective as opposed to trying to do this as an individual. And you mentioned some leaders not having the courage to speak truth to power. And I wonder if you have thoughts on what people, perhaps people listening, could think about doing to create more momentum and kind of prevent themselves from being that one person who's way out on that limb, right? That, kind of come together with other people who are like-minded and might be able to, we were talking about power before too. I think there are power in numbers as well. So.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I've been that person out on the limb and, shouting at everybody, like, why don't you care? And it's just, you can't make people care. You just can't. I have found probably the most compelling exercise that I've done over the years is lead people through like a why exercise. So like Simon Sinek, start with the why. We often start with the how and the what. Racism is a problem, sexism is a problem, and that just causes resistance when you start like that. So instead, find a way to meet the person where they're at, right? Like, what do you care about? What are your values? Why? Like, is the status quo? Like, why if everything stays the same way? Like, how would we hurt? Like, what would we lose? And if you can kind of tap into people's natural feelings, most humans, right? Again, 90% want these things. They want inclusion for not just them, but for others. And so over the years, I've, led people through the exercise and they say really interesting things. It's fun to do like a word cloud with them, but I usually share mine as an example is I have three girls. Of course I want the world to be more inclusive for them because it wasn't for me. And I don't want them to have the same crappy, corporate experience that I did. That's silly. I want there to be more inclusive leaders for them and future generations. And sometimes that resonates with people. It's kind of a common one. That's a big entry point for men that are fathers of girls, which I used to be like, oh my gosh, I roll. But at this point, let's take what we can get, people. Don't be judgy. Like, if that's the entry point, take it. Like, let's build from there. But it could be, sometimes people share like my values of fairness and justice are very strong. Sometimes people mention personal relationships they've had with a mentor that was different than them or their caregivers growing up. It could be, it's usually personal though. The business case doesn't usually come up because there is a strong business case associated with inclusion work, but people rarely say, well, I want to be more profitable. I mean, yes, that happens too, business people, but it's often the human intrinsic belief.
Mm.
When you map to that and then you tie the work to that, that you're helping with that, I call it your ally why. If everything's centered in that, then when something weird happens in the news or some executive order comes out, you're not going to waver on it because you've already defined that this is personally important to you. And that's the work we have to get back to at organizations. That's where we need to start is really crafting a solid why around it, why it matters, why if we don't do this, what's it going to cost us? And humans naturally loss aversion, we don't like to lose things. And so show people what they stand to lose. I mean, we're losing things right now. I am concerned about the long-term impact of this, not even 9 months.
Yeah,
It's just
you're
been
right.
a lot.
You're absolutely right. It's exhausting and it impacts every one of us. And one of the things that comes up for me too, as you talk about sort of the emotional charge of talking about race and gender right now, is I have found it really helpful to frame this discussion using the introvert extrovert dynamic because
Yep.
introversion is often a a trait that makes people feel excluded because workplaces are so biased towards whoever's the loudest and the fastest when it comes to sharing their ideas. And introversion cuts across every other dimension of identity, right? And so I have found that if we, sort of start with something like that, it can be a good baby step in the direction of at least getting people to open their minds to, oh yeah, I can see how this affects me, or I can see where I can be more of an ally in these meetings that I'm in. And then it kind of opens that, it can open the door a little bit more broadly towards other dimensions of identity. But I think kind of starting there can be feel a little safer for people.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I don't have that one on my towers exercise. You got me thinking about that. That's a good one. I teach a class at Indiana University in the business school, and it's about decision making. And one of our modules is on exactly that personality and how personality, diversity of personality, influences decision making. And exactly the point you're saying. And Susan Cain talked about this in her book, Quiet, right? Introverts, yeah, just because you're not the loudest and the fastest doesn't mean your ideas are any less valid. They probably are much more valid because you've thought about them more. So we're losing out, right? I mean, what is that back to what is that costing us when we let the loudest, fastest voices dominate? Innovation, risky decision. I mean, just all sorts of things. If you were to just take a second to quantify the impact of that and think about strategies that we could do to work across different personality styles. I mean, think about how powerful it would be to have respect for people's, different types of working styles. And that's something like trust I mentioned earlier. That's something that kind of the basics that I'm getting back to. I have like a self-awareness course in allyship that people are requesting now, which I was like, huh, man, the things that I developed a long time ago are kind of going full circle on. And then I get in my head of like, I need to be pushing, to your point, faster, pushing people to like go back to the extremes. But maybe we hadn't done a lot of the foundational work I think that we needed to do to make more complex things happen. So maybe this going back to the basics, as I would call it, is something that we needed to do all along. And this is our calling to do it so that we can do the meaningful work and the longer term work later.
I think you're absolutely right. And you talked about loss aversion, and I just think that in times of great anxiety, we are that much more sensitive to change. And I think right now people are just really worried and change
Mhm.
feels scary, even if it's good change. And so we do have to get back to basics and really just kind of take people with us on this journey because the true believers are already there.
I
Right?
know we're just talking to each other. And
Exactly.
It's really comforting, and I really do like those conversations. Like, oh, they're on the same page. I don't have to worry. That's not how we're going to move forward. Like, that's clearly not like we need to talk to other people that think differently than us, and it's uncomfortable. It's not going to be. If this was easy, we would have done it already.
You're right.
And then the people are like, Julie, why do I have to keep doing this? Why don't they do it too? And it's like, I know it's frustrating. I am like losing my patience every day, but I also know that this is too important for us not to work on it together.
Exactly, exactly. And so truly I could talk to you all day, but in the interest of time, I know this is your work. So where can people find you if they want to learn more, stay connected to you?
Yeah. So my business's name is Next Pivot Point. So nextpivotpoint.com. There we have free training videos, all sorts of like really cool resources. And I have a Forbes column where I publish weekly. So you can follow me on Forbes or LinkedIn as well, Julie Kratz, Kratz.
Wonderful. I'll make sure those links are in the show notes as well. And thank you so much for what you're doing. I can only imagine what a struggle it is for you every day. But I think, you're doing really important work. I'm grateful on behalf of everybody listening as well. And thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to the Impostor Syndrome Files. If you would like to continue this conversation in a safe and trusted space, I would love for you to join my virtual discussion group every Thursday at 12 p.m. Eastern. For the past several years, the group has been limited to women, but it is now open, regardless of gender, to anyone who is interested in exploring and troubleshooting common workplace challenges, building better awareness of ourselves and others, and becoming more inclusive allies at work. Check out the show notes for more info on how to find us, and please join us next week for another episode of the Impostor Syndrome Files.